Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be showing you how I made this. So for those of you who follow me on TikTok, you may have already seen this particular mask. Now this is my Exo Warlock mask from Destiny 2. And I really love how it turned out. Complete with a moving jaw, it's the best. Now, originally I had planned to make this mask using 3D printing. I had the model set up, all fixed. I'll put a link to the model in the description below, although I only ended up using it as a reference. Annoyingly, with the supports needed to actually get a decent print of this particular prop, it was going to end up costing me about $200 to print. So I believe it was around 4.5 kilograms of filament I needed, just because of all the supports needed to keep this from falling apart. So that wasn't viable. So I decided, what if I can make it out of foam? What if I can make it using just the things I have lying around the house? What if I can make it for $0? And I did. Now, if you were to make this yourself and buy all of the materials, it would probably cost you somewhere around $50. The foam was $10 for a 4-pack and I only ended up using one of those. The spray paint can be expensive because it's a special metallic paint, but otherwise there's not a lot to this. There's some super glue, there's some foam, and there's some paint and a little bit of elastic as this chin strap. And what I really like about this particular build is that it's accessible. This is something that I could have definitely made when I first started out prop making, before all of the equipment, before any of the things that I have now. I could have probably made this. And as much as I like 3D printing and what it's done for my prop making, sometimes you just gotta go back to the basics. Now, I'm not the greatest foam smith in the world. I am definitely a beginner when it comes to making props out of foam. But it's a really good, cheap alternative for prop making. And you can still build stuff like this. See, check it out. This is really cool. So without further ado, let me show you how I made this. So I am going to race through a lot of this first part here, but essentially what I'm doing is I've got this mask and I'm creating a template based on the mask. This was just a lot easier than trying to model it off my own face. If you had a mannequin of some sort, that would also be a great alternative, but I only had this mask, so this is what I used. So I'm referencing the actual model files as well as the diffuse and texture files to get a sort of an idea of what shapes I should be cutting out of this template. Anything that looks like it should be a separate piece or is perhaps at a different angle than another section, I'm cutting that out. As you go, you can tape all of these templates together and eventually you'll have a paper mock-up of the mask. And this technique doesn't have to just be used to make a mask. You can make it for other props. You could also use it if you want to do some clothing as well, based off your own body shape. This is also a way to do it. But I'm going to jump ahead here because you will see these separate pieces later on in the video. And this particular shot doesn't really give you a good sense of what's going on. So as I said in the intro, for this build we're going to be using these EVA foam floor mats. Now I picked these up from Bunnings for $10, there was 4 in a pack, and I think I ended up using about 1 and a bit of these sheets. These are really cheap, really good to use, really nice thickness, and they just work wonderfully. So here I'm making the back section of the mask. I'm using a scalpel knife to trace around this so that I could cut it out later. And I'm also flipping this onto the other side so I can make one continuous piece. I do end up cutting this in half anyway, just to get the sizing right, but this gives you an idea of how you can do it. So once that's all traced, I can use the scalpel knife again and cut it out properly. Now I found this actually left quite a rough cut on the foam, and I end up switching to using scissors for this section later on. Now it's time to take the rest of our template and actually, well, deconstruct it. As pretty as it is, it's no use to us altogether, so we need to actually break it into the parts so that we can lay it flat onto the foam mats and cut them out. I'm actually extending this piece a little further than the template shows so that I can cut it back to size when I put it up with the other pieces. A lot of these patterns are not exact patterns, and so I want a little bit of leeway so that I can chop and change later on. Throughout this process, I am constantly checking the pieces against other pieces, as well as checking the sizing against my own face. This is a very iterative process, and it does take a little bit until I'm completely happy with the sizing and shape. Now, to glue all the pieces together, I'm just using super glue. There's a lot of other alternatives, but I like to use super glue because it's pretty strong and it dries really fast, which is good for building things like this. So here I'm checking the shape of where these two pieces need to join, and I'm recutting the end here so that it actually lines up nice and proper. And once I'm happy with that first half, I'm going to use it to trace the second half. I actually had a paper template for this particular piece, but because I'd made a lot of alterations to the original side, I decided to use this as a template for the second piece. Now this looks like a little bit of an odd thing to do, but what I'm doing here is folding the piece in half and taking a small triangle out of it. This is basically a dart, if anyone has done sewing before, and it'll help me bend the pieces to the right shape. But now we can glue the two sides together, and this was another thing I had to do a couple of times just to make sure the sizing was right. And again, I've left a little bit of excess here so that I can cut it to the right shape. Once that was done, I moved on to the eye sockets. Now the eye sockets are made out of two pieces of foam that are joined at quite a sharp angle. In the paper template, this was simply a circular shape that was folded in half, but foam struggles to fold that sharply, so I needed to cut it into two separate pieces and join them together. Because this was such a sharp joint and there wasn't a lot of contact between the two pieces, I've added some scrap pieces of foam to the gap at the back and glued them in to make sure it's a bit more secure and strong. So now I can put it up to the rest of the mask and make sure it's the right size and cut it down to shape if it's not. Hey look, I made a second eye socket. Now what I was finding with these pieces is that they weren't actually sitting in flush with the rest of the mask, and to fix that I cut the edges on a slight angle so that it would actually sit flat, and this is what you can see here. Alrighty, and now that the eyes and sockets are done, it's time to move on to the centerpiece of the faceplate. So on my template, this was originally one piece, but again, I need this to be angled at the center, so I ended up cutting it in half. This also saves on some foam as well. And then I put it up to the rest of the mask and made sure it all fit to size. Once I was happy that this was going to sit in really well, I used this piece and traced it to form the other side. This piece in particular had to be glued down bit by bit to make sure it was actually reaching the curvature I needed. I also had to continuously cut off little bits of the center at an angle so that when it joined together it actually curved. And then there was one last piece to cut out, which was the little ridge that happens on the faceplate. I just freehanded this one as it was a fairly simple shape, and I could just cut it down to size and readjust it as needed. I then sorted out all the scraps on my floor into usable and not usable, and put the not usable ones in the bin. If you've got any significant cuts of foam, you can definitely use those again. I then started to 3D print the mandibles, but it just didn't end up working, but we'll get back to that. And the safety inspector Greg is here to remind you that we're going to be doing something dangerous, which in this case is sanding foam. Now I'm using a rotary tool for this. You do not want to breathe in any of this dust, so make sure you wear the appropriate safety goggles and appropriate mask. I haven't actually done this on foam before. I've seen a lot of other YouTubers and creators do it, and it looked so much easier than the horrible mess that I usually get into when I'm cleaning up foam. And I have to say, I really like it. I don't think I had the right bit. I think I need a proper sander for it, but it did seem to do the job. So if you are thinking of prop making with foam, probably invest in a rotary tool. This was definitely worth it. And luckily I didn't have to spend a cent on this tool because I stole my little brother's. Don't worry, I gave it back, I promise. And once all sanded, it looked something like this. So you know how I said the 3D printed mandibles didn't work out very well? Yeah, I couldn't get them out of the supports and they were a bit too big, so I ended up using them as more of a guide and made the mandibles out of foam. This worked out way better in the end, and I'll show you why in a sec. A lot of this is out of frame, I'm really sorry about that, but you'll see the full mandible in a second, and it's fairly simple shapes. So you can see the mandible shape just there. It's made up of 3 pieces, and I did end up cutting these down a bit to make sure that they fit my jaw. So now it's time to make the mouthpiece part, and I used 2 separate pieces of foam to do that, and the rotary tool to sand them into what looked like lips according to the model. Sorry I didn't get any footage of that, but if you've ever used Blender before, it's fairly similar to the process you'd go about carving something out there. And now I just glued them on. But before I could glue on the bottom piece of the mouth, I had to glue on the mandibles first. This was around where I realised they were the wrong size and cut them down a little further, as you can see here. One thing I love about using foam is it's just so malleable and bendable that you can actually bend it into shapes like curves. So it worked really well for this particular project. And here is just some accent pieces of the jaw. I was originally going to leave these as the 3D printed pieces, but they were too big, so I had to resize them. And now I'm just adding some details to the mouth area in the form of little scrap pieces of foam. I think this works really well and looks a lot like tendons. And here is a test fit. And because of the properties of foam that it is bendable, the lower jaw actually moves so I can get the mouth to move. This was very intentional in this design. And I did end up using a chin strap in the form of a little piece of elastic to make this stay on my chin more accurately. And here I'm just cutting out some more details in the form of the ears of this mask. These are made out of two circular pieces of foam which are glued on top of each other and are then sanded down to the correct shape. And so after sanding they look something like this. And now to make some more details for the ears in the form of these little antenna things. And these are just glued on like so, and you can even bend them out a little bit, especially if you apply heat, and they'll retain that new shape. Now my particular Exo Warlock has the larger variation of the ears, so she has an extra bit that goes on the side, and that's what I'm cutting out here. And now it's time for the primer. And once the primer was dry, I put on its first coat of this really cool copper looking paint. This paint is by Rust-Oleum. It's the Universal Advanced Formula Metallic Paint and Primer in one, in the color Aged Copper. But after I had painted it, I realized there was a whole bunch of gaps that were very, very visible in the copper color, so I ended up going back with a wood filler to fill these all in. There are definitely better things you can use. This is simply what I had on hand. I believe you can get a foam clay that will do a miraculous job of covering up these holes. But this wood filler seemed to do the trick, and it's something that I'm comfortable with using. Although I hadn't used it on foam before at this stage, I usually use it on my 3D printed props. And I found that it kind of made the foam a little bit more rigid in these areas, which was pretty good. That was actually what I wanted to achieve for this section. And once I was all happy that the gaps were all filled in, I sanded it with the rotary tool and it looked something like this. And then I added another layer of spray paint. Now it's not the cleanest looking finish, maybe I'll put something to smooth it over the top later, but for now I was pretty happy with this. So now it's time for one of my favorite parts. I get to paint in the details, and I'm just using acrylic paints for this. I think the acrylic paint really brings it all together. It goes from just this mediocre, finished looking mask to something that actually pops and looks like an exo head. I think one day I'd really like to invest in an airbrush for doing this sort of thing, especially things like weathering my props, but at this stage a brush works just fine. And I'm going to let the video speak for itself for the next section here. So then I did a test fit, and although I liked the paint job, I wasn't really happy with the overall shape. Something just wasn't quite right. It didn't really look like my exo, and I couldn't work it out. So I ended up mucking around a little with the mask, moving things around to see what worked, and I came up with this, where I moved these mandible details upwards at a sharper angle, and added these parts to the mouth, which is a bit more similar to the model, and I think it made a world of difference, and I am so much more happier with this now. But this prop is far from finished. There are a few things I want to do in the future with this prop. The main one is I want to add some lenses and some LEDs to the eye. I think that'll really make it pop, because right now you can see my eyes and they're in a weird position as well. It's not like I can just stick some contact lenses in and it'll be fine. They're in a weird spot. So I'm hoping to get those LEDs around the end of the week. Based on that, stay tuned for a video coming soon on how to install lights into masks like this, assuming everything goes well. But guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I had a lot of fun making this, and it only took me about 2 days, and they weren't long days either, so this is definitely a really cool thing that is really accessible to everyone. But if you like what I'm doing here, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more of these. I'll probably be showing this mask a lot in my TikTok videos, so definitely check me out on TikTok if you want to see more of this mask. And there'll probably be some photography going up on Instagram of this cosplay when it's a little bit more complete. I have plans to make a really basic robe, whether that ends up just being a jacket that I've chucked some foam pieces on or what it is, I'm not sure at this stage. And I'd also like to make a ghost for this character as well. So there are a few things to hopefully look forward to in the future. But that's really all I have to say. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you all next Friday. Bye! Oh, I am so glad my parents did not walk in when I was filming this. They're gonna think this mask is the weirdest thing I've ever made. 100%.